5 performances there'll be an intermission so you can all breathe. We have found during the 7 events this week that if anyone stays in this room for longer than 12-13 minutes, they start to lose their mind, which I enjoy. People do not enjoy. So, yeah, this is the last night of the exhibition, and I'll say thank yous to all the people who have made it such an amazing fortnight at the very end of the event. And I won't get in the way of the 5 people who are going to present their work to us tonight. So without further ado, we introduce the amazing Tamarin Norwood.
Thank you. I asked him to say inimitable, but you can't get anything you want to ask. Now I'm afraid I'm not reading new writing, I'm reading old writing. I wrote this in 2010. But given the enemies theme of the evening, I couldn't resist reading this one out, so I hope you enjoy it. I was reading a lot of John Bart and Clarence Major and Friends at the time, and I think their influence probably shows. I'm only going to read the first half of this, a longer prose piece. The one writing turns the pen in her fingertips and dabs the nib against her tongue. She holds it still for a second or two until the coldness gives way to taste, and she feels it salty and lightly acrid. She brings the wet nib to the page and writes until the line returns to full opacity. The semi-opaque words begin to describe the left nipple of O, which in the present prose is tight, with the attention of the sharp and cold nib. She favours cursive script for its continuous contact with the page and its long and sweeping descenders, for curving into subsequent letters and even lazily into subsequent words. She writes lazily. Each word lingers on the page until the next begins, their pauses filling with slow curves of ink as the pen resists leaving the surface of the page until it inscribes into view every inch of the undressed skin. These close attentions are marked on the body of the protagonist for minutes on end in the wordless sensation of being particularly there. She feels neither heat nor swelling, but a kind of fullness that causes her skin to linger in mind for reasons beyond her. She thinks of the words, beyond me. The author pauses her protagonist in soft-lit rooms for their encounters, and as her caresses begins, she softens the texture of the walls and causes her to barely breathe. In these moments of stillness, the author wants to be still too, and commune with O, as lovers do in pauses. She pauses the nib against the page mid-word, in the thick of the letter I of sigh. She holds her lover's breath in her fingertips and closes her eyes to exhale with her, but as the pen stops, O drops out of sight, temporarily unwritten. Alone, suddenly she opens her eyes and leans over the paper to watch the grain absorb the ink and holds until it saturates the ground around it. When finally she moves the nib, it wades in a trough of black and dislodges the fibres, pulling an empty hole in the page. She cannot cause the passing of their times to correspond. For O to be still, she must move her pen. When the pen is still, there is no O at all. She does her best to overlook the fluctuations in their love scenes, trying above all to keep the prose steady against her lover's body so at least her form is uninterrupted. As the pen moves against the page and the fullness moves against the skin, the tug of each woman toward the other registers for O only indistinctly, as a hazy, objectless longing that accumulates in her skin. The one writing thinks about making herself known to the one written. She worries. To do this would inflict upon O the difficult revelation that she is fictional, with no telling what the news might do to her delicate narrative coherence. It was her fullness of character that had tugged at the author's affections in the first place, and if it was suddenly compromised, she might disintegrate into a thing too unconvincing to love. Instead, imagines the author, the news must arrive in increments, so gentle they incorporate themselves into O's reality, even as it slides into fiction and the waiting arms of her creator. The thing is to be gradual. Casting around for what to do, the author begins to tentatively thin the surface of the fiction. There begins a sequence of very lucid episodes contrived to draw the attention of the protagonist to the detail with which her person is described. O is moved to examine the patterns of veins extending to her fingertips and clouded by the skin of her wrist on the way, and is struck by the clarity of each pore, each fine crease, the symmetry of the lines on the palm of her hand. She stares at the symmetry with some surprise and thinks the word unusual. She notes the stillness of time. The moment is left behind on the page and the writing carries her on as before. Her life continues as normal for some weeks and pages until she's apprehended by another such intimate attention, the roundness of her right iris, which again passes and is largely forgotten. Over time, these attentions become familiar and frequent and begin to settle themselves into her understanding of the world, alongside the occasional sensations of fullness that continue to visit her skin. As her character begins to incorporate the deliberate detail with which her physical periphery is defined, the author sets about opening fine cracks in the narrative surface, first of all by means of unconvincing prose. She stands in front of the bathroom mirror and props her fingertips against her lips in a thoughtful pose. She has her think a sentence about there being somebody watching over me and immediately recoil, not only at the sentiment but at the turn of phrase. She holds the paper close against the surface of her skin and her caresses spread like a list. Page by page she engineers increasing deliberateness in the thoughts and the senses of the protagonist, which come to feel patently rehearsed and begin to describe themselves as badly written. With these preparations laid, the author leans back from the page and writes at speed. She advances recklessly. Not only the surface language but the events themselves begin to veer into an implausibility. To steady herself as she writes, she leans closely toward the paper again and watches the grain and its intersection with the pen. They continue to interact as they always do, smooth against one another, dry and then wet, and then dry, bare, and then inscribed. Holding together her lover, she forces the narrative apart. No time for the fullness of skin. It rains when she cries, clouds look painted on. Once, for almost a second, slow motion. And at home, the carpet looks unfamiliar. The bedroom door edges a couple of inches down the corridor. The laundry cupboard has no gravity. Oh listens to the thoughts she thinks as she presses the towels back down against their shelves. Such is her lover's unease, anticipates the author, that when the revelation finally envelops her, she will accept it with relief, as the welcome explanation for some protracted physiological malaise. And one day it just arrives. Quite suddenly and naturally, as O is waiting for the bus under a rainbow. The thought occurs to her in a simple breath and is supplied without recoil or response. You're making this up. The rainbow beams. The one writing pauses to read back. With alarm, she finds herself unable to sustain the fullness of O's character without causing her to despise her creator. After the rather saccharine episode with the rainbow and the assaults on physics and all the private attentions to her naked skin, anything else to be unconvincing. Writing hastily, she swerves at some distance from the page as events collide into one another at uncomfortable speed. Tussles between her will to see O as a plausible creature and her will for O to acknowledge authorship result in a sequence of theatrical suicide attempts, of which one finally succeeds. A swiftly conceived premise for the death is an idea in the character's mind between the stricture tightening and the brain closing, she might occupy an instant outside of authorship and entirely her own. With what remains of the dwindling affection for the protagonist, the author regrets that the moment of her death fails to escape her pen. Since these affections began, the author has noticed that she writes not to have written, but to be writing. Only while she moves her nib does she write her lover into life, and each word and its curve bonds them only once, and for an instant. She watches the paper they've left behind, and although the words recall the unsteadily synchronized dance of the lovers, they are not the dance itself. So the death of O is nothing new. She has been continually in death throughout the draft, trying and hardening against the pages word after word, in time with the passing of her nib. This death is particular only because of its finality, which relegates the author to reading the O that has been, rather than writing the O that is. It is a finality the author prefers not to keep. Thank you.